Welcome, good morning, a very good day to you all. I hope this video finds you safe and sound. Today, inshallah, we are going to discuss the institutions of the French Fifth Republic. And before we start, let's remind ourselves of the major concern of General Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle in 1958 created a political system in which the executive branch of government was very, very strong vis-à-vis the legislature. In other words, President Charles de Gaulle was not especially happy about the state of political instability that used to exist in the Fourth Republic. The Fourth Republic lasted for 12 years, from 1946 to 1958. 12 years. And this 12 years saw 22 governments form and dissolve, an average of a government every 6 months. General Charles de Gaulle was not really happy about this situation, and when he was appointed Prime Minister just after the liberation of France 1944, he wanted to impose his viewpoint on Parliament. He wanted to recreate the system in this way to have a strengthened executive, but the members of Parliament refused this, as we said the last time, because the members of the Vichy regime were very strongly fresh in their minds, and they did not want to create a strong and a dictatorial executive, and they favored the recreation of the Third Republic, which was also a parliamentary system that was not quite stable. But at any rate, this is what happened, and General Charles de Gaulle found an opportunity to reimpose his viewpoint in 1958 because he used the constitutional crisis that existed then. Now we are going to start with the presidency. Articles 5 through 19 of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic establish the position of the president. And in fact, the position of the president is discussed meticulously in the Constitution. And perhaps this is the longest part of the Constitution, the part that is devised or allocated for discussing the powers of the president and the position of the president. The president is the most prestigious post in the Fifth Republic. He is entitled with making sure that the Constitution is fully respected by all the state institutions, by the people, by everybody in the Republic. He is entitled with making sure that the state institutions function properly. So this is the first important task of the president. He can do anything in order to make sure that there is proper functioning of the state institutions. Number 2, the president is the one who appoints the prime minister. And he also appoints the cabinet ministers on the recommendation of the latter. And this is a very important power of the president of the republic. And here we have to pause for some moments in order to discuss this power. Now, in theory and according to the Constitution, the president is free to appoint whomever he wants to be prime minister. There is no constitutional obligation that requires the president to appoint the leader of the majority party in the lower house of parliament as the prime minister. This is usually the case in parliamentary systems, but the president of the French Fifth Republic is not obligated by the Constitution to do so, but it is usually the case that he appoints the leader of the majority party. But why is this the case? Despite the absence of a constitutional provision that requires the president to do so, and despite the fact that the Constitution gives him free hand to appoint any person to serve as Prime Minister, he finds himself in fact, under huge political pressure in order to appoint the leader of the majority party. Because the Constitution stipulates that after the President appoints the Prime Minister, the latter has got to go to Parliament in order to seek its approval. So the Prime Minister must seek the support of Parliament, specifically of the lower house, the National Assembly. The National Assembly has got to support the government statement of the Prime Minister that is given by the Prime Minister in Parliament. This is the program of the government for the coming years. This is called the government statement. So the government statement that is read by the Prime Minister in Parliament must be supported by a majority of the members of Parliament. If the Prime Minister cannot secure a majority to support him, then he has to tender his resignation to the President. So this is what is written in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. The Constitution says that the President appoints the Prime Minister, but the Constitution is silent on who the person that should be appointed by the President is, but at the same time it says that the Prime Minister must seek the approval of Parliament of the National Assembly. Again, the National Assembly can at any time withdraw confidence from the Prime Minister, from the government. And in this case, again, if the National Assembly is not supportive of the choice of the President, they can withdraw confidence from the government. Third, the Constitution of the Fifth Republic gives the President the right to chair cabinet meetings. It is usually the case that the cabinet holds a meeting periodically. Every week there should be a meeting by the ministers. It is the President of the Republic who is entitled with, or who has the power to chair those cabinet meetings. Not the Prime Minister, but in exceptional circumstances, the Prime Minister can preside over the meetings of the Council of Ministers. If, for example, the President asks him to replace himself in the cabinet meetings, this can happen, or in cases of cohabitation. In cases of cohabitation. And this is a state in which the President of the Republic is from one party, while the National Assembly is controlled by another party. This is called cohabitation. In this case, the President has got to appoint the leader of the opposition party as the Prime Minister, and in this case, the President becomes under pressure to yield to the wishes of the Prime Minister regarding his choices for the ministers who are going to serve with him in the Council of Ministers. So it is usually the case that when there is a unified government, in other words, when the President and the Prime Minister are from the same party, when the party of the President controls the majority of seats in the National Assembly, it is usually the case that the President becomes all too strong. He becomes very, very influential. He appoints the Prime Minister and he intervenes in the choices of the Prime Minister regarding the ministers who are going to serve in the Council of Ministers, in the Cabinet. But this is not the case when the President and the Prime Minister are from two different parties. So in this case, when there is a case of cohabitation, it is usually the case that the Prime Minister usually chairs the cabinet meetings. 3. The President has got to ratify the acts that are passed by Parliament, by the National Assembly and the Senate, within a period of 15 days of their passage. Does the President of the Fifth Republic has the power to veto the bills that are passed by Parliament? Does he have a power that is equal to the veto power of the President of the United States? The answer is no. And this is one weakness that is suffered by the President of the Fifth Republic in France. The President, all that he can do is ask Parliament to reopen debate on the pieces of legislation that have been passed. But if Parliament sticks to its opinion, the President has no other alternative but to proclaim those bills and to sign them into laws. So this is all the President can do. He can just return the piece of legislation to Parliament, to the House of Parliament in which the bill originated, and ask Parliament to reopen debate, to reconsider the legislation, either in whole or in part. Either the whole of the piece of legislation or a specific piece of it, just to reopen debate, just to reconsider it. But the President has no other alternative but to accept and sign the bill once Parliament sticks to it again. The President can submit issues to the people in public referenda. And this is also one of the important powers that are given to the President of the Fifth Republic. If there is an important issue that the President wants to put to the people, if there is an important bill that are related to the organization of the state institutions, something that is related to a constitutional act of Parliament, something that is related to the powers of the state authorities, for example, anything of the sort, the President can put in front of the people in a national referendum on the recommendation of the government, on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. This power, the plebiscite power or the referenda power, is not given to the President of the United States. The President of the US cannot put questions to the people in public referenda. And by this power, the President of the French Fifth Republic can circumvent Parliament, can sidestep Parliament. So if the President wants to introduce a specific bill, provided that this bill is related to the structure of the state authorities, he can do so without returning to Parliament. He can do so without going back to Parliament. He is not required to pass this bill in the normal way as a bill that is studied and debated by Parliament. So this is a very important power that makes the President of the Fifth Republic strong vis-a-vis the legislature. Another important power that is given to the President of the Fifth Republic is the power to dissolve Parliament. And here we are talking about the National Assembly, which is the lower house of Parliament and the most important of the two houses of it. The President, after consulting the Prime Minister and the Presidents of both houses of Parliament, can dissolve the National Assembly. Again, this power is not granted to the President of the United States. There is complete and total separation of powers in the US between the President and Congress. The President cannot dissolve Congress, and Congress cannot withdraw confidence from the President. They can just impeach him under very exceptional circumstances. But there is complete separation of powers. But here in France, and as a translation, an honest translation of the wishes of Charles de Gaulle to enhance and strengthen the position of the executive vis-a-vis Parliament, he gave the President the right to dissolve the National Assembly. But can the President dissolve the National Assembly when there is a case of cohabitation? In fact, this thing has not been tested in the Fifth Republic so far. All the times in which the presidents dissolved the National Assembly were times of unified governments. In other words, both the president and the government were from the same party. The party of the president was in control of the National Assembly. Has this happened before? Yes, it happened. It happened, for example, in the year 1997. In 1997, President Jacques Chirac, who was just 2 years in office as president, decided to dissolve the National Assembly, which was also controlled by his party. But he wanted to strengthen the grip of his party on parliament. He wanted his party to have a bigger majority, a bigger number of seats in parliament. Unluckily, the elections, the legislative elections of 1997 produced a parliament that came to be controlled by the opposing party, by the socialists. And all the president did was that he appointed the leader of the majority party as prime minister. His name was Lionel Jospin. So Lionel Jospin was a socialist. He was from the French Socialist Party, but the president, who was from the right, had no other option but to appoint him. And this situation of cohabitation lasted for 5 long years, the whole lifetime of parliament. So it is usually the case that when the president dissolves the National Assembly, it has been the case that the National Assembly is controlled by the same party of the president. Can the president dissolve the National Assembly during a state of cohabitation? This has not happened before, and it's not known whether this can happen or not. The president signs the decrees that are passed by the Council of Ministers. Here we can differentiate between 2 types of organizational orders. We have something called bills, and these are the laws that are passed by Parliament, and we have something else that is called decrees or executive orders or ordinances. So an ordinance or an executive order or a decree is an organizational thing that is passed by the Council of Ministers, by the Cabinet. Does it have the same legal status as that of laws? The answer is yes. So the decrees that are issued by the Council of Ministers have got the same legal status as the laws that are passed by Parliament. They must be obeyed by all citizens. They must be abided by. They must be applied by the government departments, and so on. If they are violated, the citizens who violate them will be punished by law. So they have the very same legal status as laws. The president signs all the decrees that come to be passed by the Council of Ministers. This also means that he can refuse to sign them. So it's up to the President of the Republic either to accept or to decline and reject the decrees that are issued by the Prime Minister, by the Council of Ministers. What happens if there is a case of cohabitation? If the Prime Minister is from a different party. In this case, and if the Prime Minister insists on passing or issuing these decrees, he just goes to Parliament and passes the decrees in the form of laws, in the form of acts of Parliament. In this case, the President has no other alternative but to accept and sign those bills, because he is obliged to do so according to the stipulations of the Constitution. So this happens when there is a case of cohabitation only. If there is a case of cohabitation, it is usually the case that the President and the Prime Minister are at odds. They are different. They have different points of view, different policies, different ideologies. And in this case, the decrees that are issued by the Council of Ministers might not appeal to the President of the Republic, and because of this he might be tempted not to sign them in order to hinder the work of the government. And in this case, if the Council of Ministers is intent on passing these decrees, the Prime Minister has got to go to Parliament, and because the Prime Minister has the majority in Parliament, he can easily pass them in the form of laws, in which case the President does not have the power to reject them. As we said before, the President of the Fifth Republic does not have the veto power. All that he has is the power to just send back the bills to Parliament for more debate, for more study, for more discussion. But if Parliament sticks to its opinion, all the President can do is just to sign the laws. The President makes appointments to civil and military posts. He appoints, for example, the Prime Minister in addition to the ministers. He also appoints the ambassadors of France to foreign countries, and he also recognizes and accepts and receives the other foreign ministers to Paris. In addition to this, he also appoints the top military personnel. And we are going to see that this power is also shared with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, according to the wording of the Constitution, also has the power to make civil and military appointments. In addition to this, the Constitution of the Fifth Republic makes the Prime Minister responsible for national defense, which is also the same power of the President. So, how can we differentiate between the realms of the two persons, of the two officials? In fact, there is nothing in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic that distinguishes or that settles this conflict in powers between the Prime Minister and the President. And what usually happens and what usually takes place and what has evolved as a rule of thumb is that when the President of the Republic controls the majority of seats in Parliament, when his party is in control of the majority of seats in the National Assembly, the President becomes very influential. He becomes responsible for everything. He wields all powers in his hands. He becomes the number one official in the country. But if there is a case of cohabitation, if he is from one party and the Prime Minister is from a different party, it has been the norm that the President becomes responsible only for two policy areas, national defense and foreign policy. But regarding everything else, regarding the day-to-day affairs of the country, regarding the laws that will organize the economy, organize the working of the system, everything else is going to be the task of the Prime Minister and of the Council of Ministers. So this is a norm that has evolved out of practice, that in times of cohabitation, the President of the Republic takes a couple of steps backwards, and he considers himself only responsible for matters of foreign policy and national defense, but not for running the day-to-day affairs of the country. Next, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, according to the Constitution, and he presides over the higher national councils and committees of defense. And we have just said that this power is shared with the Prime Minister. And by the way, the President of the Republic can ask the Prime Minister to replace him as chair or as head of some of these national defense committees in special circumstances or in exceptional circumstances. Article 16 of the Constitution is very, very important. And it gives the President of the Republic a huge power and a huge influence over the system. According to this article, the President can declare a state of emergency. and rule by decree. So the president, under very special circumstances, can rule the country by decree, by executive orders that are issued by him. And these executive orders must be obeyed as if they are laws. They have the same legal status as laws. What are these specific circumstances? If the institutions of the Republic are at risk, or the independence of the nation is endangered, or the integrity of its territories is also at risk, and the normal functioning of the state institutions is not correct, is not operative, or if the fulfillment of international commitments of the French state is at risk. In all these circumstances, the president can step in and declare a state of emergency. The President of the United States does not have a similar power, despite the fact that the President of the United States is one of the strongest in the world in terms of executive power, but strangely enough, he does not have a similar power that is provided for in the Constitution of the United States. Yes, it has evolved out of practice. The presidents have acquired to themselves the right to declare a state of national emergency in specific policy areas, but this is not a right that is mentioned clearly, that is stated frankly in the Constitution of the United States, which makes the President of France really very, very strong. The president can also grant individual pardons to persons that have been convicted by courts. And this is equal to the judicial power of other heads of state. It is usually the case that heads of state wield this exclusive power. They have the right either to commute the verdict, to make it less severe, or to just pardon the convict, the person who has been tried in front of a court of law and have been found to be guilty of a specific crime. But this pardon does not mean that the person has been acquitted. It just means that the person is not going to be subjected to the punishment that is incurred by committing this crime. But this crime remains on his record. This is a judicial power that is given to the President of France and to all other heads of state. The President of France can also communicate with the two houses of Parliament by messages. He can send messages to the Speaker of the House, to the Speaker of the National Assembly, and to the President of the Senate. He can also give speeches in a joint session of both houses of Parliament at any time of his own choice. So these are the powers of the President of the Fifth Republic, and it is clear from our discussion of these powers that the position of the President has been augmented or strengthened by the Constitution. The Cabinet. The Cabinet consists of the Prime Minister and the Ministers, and both of them are appointed by the President of the Republic according to the rules that we have discussed. The Cabinet is entitled with determining and conducting the policy of the nation, so it has the power to issue decrees, to issue ordinances that are related to running the affairs of the country. the Prime Minister is named and appointed by the President according to the regulations that we have just discussed. There is a degree of overlap between the powers of the Prime Minister and those of the President. As we said before, some specific powers are given to both of them. The President is responsible for protecting the borders of the country, the national sovereignty, the territorial integrity, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and at the same time the Constitution designates the Prime Minister as the one who is responsible for national defense. So this is some degree or some form of overlap in the powers of the President and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister also, according to the Constitution, can make civil and military appointments, and this power specifically is given to the President as well. How can we solve this overlap? As we said before, nothing in the Constitution settles this conflict, but a rule of thumb has developed in times of unified governments. Becomes all too strong, and he becomes responsible for executing all these powers. But in times of cohabitation, the President becomes responsible only for matters of national defense and foreign policy. We have a very important article in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, Article 23. It came to be called the Article of Incompatibility. It makes the legislative job incompatible with the executive job. So we have something called a strict separation of powers in French politics. In the parliamentary system in the UK, for example, we have already said that the ministers who are chosen by the Prime Minister must, first of all, be members of Parliament. So each minister who serves in the cabinet, who is chosen by the leader of the majority party, must also be a representative of a specific electoral district, of a specific constituency. This creates something called the fusion of powers. The fusion of powers. In the United States, however, in the presidential system of the United States, there is strict separation of powers. And likewise, there is a strict separation of powers in France under the Fifth Republic. So no member of Parliament can become or can serve simultaneously as a minister in the government. And if a specific member of Parliament is chosen by the Prime Minister to serve as a minister or a member of the Council of Ministers, he or she has got first of all to relinquish or to give up his or her seat in order to satisfy the article of incompatibility in the Constitution. Now we have something called the motion of censure, and the motion of censure is equal to the vote of no confidence. There are specific and very strict procedures for withdrawing confidence from the government. In normal circumstances, it is usually the case in parliamentary systems that the members of Parliament can withdraw confidence from the government. And the majority that is required to withdraw confidence from the government in parliamentary systems is simple majority. So by simple majority, members of any lower house of Parliament can withdraw confidence from the government, where in parliamentary systems. What do we mean by a simple majority? A simple majority means a majority of the members who are present in the session and voting and casting valid ballots. So you have a number of conditions in order to satisfy the idea of simple majority or the principle of simple majority. The members who are present in the session. So the members who are not present, who are absent, don't count. The members who are present and voting. So this means the session, but also you have to vote. In other words, those who abstain from voting, their votes don't, or their existence or their attendance does not count. In addition to this, the votes must be valid. The votes that count are only the votes that are valid. So if a member of parliament voted in a wrong way, for example, or if he or she spoiled his ballot, this spoiled vote is not going to count. Let me give you an example. If, for example, we have an assembly that is composed of 100 members, but in the session of withdrawing confidence from the government, only 90 members attended. And out of the 90 members, only 80 cast their ballots, meaning that there are 10 members who decided to abstain. And out of those 80 members who cast their ballots, we had 10 spoilt votes, or blank votes, or whatever. So, essentially now we have just 70 valid ballots. So the required majority in this case, in order to withdraw confidence from the government, is, yes, 70 divided by 2 plus 1. 70 divided by 2 gives us 35, plus 1 gives us 36. So you need just 36 votes in order to vote the government out of office, in order to withdraw confidence from the government, in order to censure the government. And censure is a word in English that means to blame somebody, blame the government. To blame the government is to withdraw confidence from it. So this is the meaning of simple majority. By simple majority, we mean a majority of those members of parliament who are present and voting and casting valid votes or valid ballots. But the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, in order to strengthen the position of the executive, in order to augment the status of the executive authority vis-a-vis Parliament, it has stipulated very tough conditions. What are these conditions? Number one, the majority that is required to withdraw confidence from the government is an absolute majority of the whole House. An absolute majority of the full size of the National Assembly. The size of the National Assembly is 577 members. So this means that it's not enough. An absolute majority means a majority of the whole members of a specific institution. It's not enough just to have a simple majority. It's not enough to have a majority of the people present and voting. No, this is not just enough. You have to have a majority of all the members. In other words, if in the session of withdrawing confidence from the government, only 300 members out of the 577 members attended. So you only have, during the session, only 300 members. What is the required majority in order to withdraw confidence from the French executive, from the cabinet? Again, it's 577 divided by 2 plus 1. This is going to give us something like 289 members. Out of what? Out of the 300 members who attended the session. It's not the case that we are going to need just 50% plus 1 of the 300, which gives us 151. No, we need a majority of all the members of the full size, all the members of the institution, all the members of the National Assembly. This is the difference between the simple majority and the absolute majority. Again, the word majority in itself means more than half. 1 plus half. Majority, unconditionally speaking, whenever this word is mentioned, it means that you have to have 50% plus one differs. That differs. That differs. That differs. If you have 50% plus one of the members who are present and casting valid votes or ballots, then this is a simple majority. But if you have a majority of all the members of a specific institution, the whole house, then this is called an absolute majority. So this has made it all the more quite difficult for the members of the National Assembly to withdraw confidence from the executive. What's more is that this motion of censure must be applied for by 1/10 of the members of Parliament. So in order, first of all, to move or to initiate the motion of censure or the no confidence vote, 1/10 of the members of the National Assembly have got to sign this petition and submit it to the Speaker of Parliament. 1/10 is equal to 58 members. So 58 members of the National Assembly must first of all must sign this petition and turn it into the Speaker of Parliament. Again, what's more is that no vote shall take place on this motion until a period of 48 hours has passed. This is mentioned in the French Constitution of the Fifth Republic. All these procedures are mentioned. You have to wait for a period of 48 hours. Why does the Constitution of the Fifth Republic stipulate or provides for this period of time? The answer is the Constitution wants to decrease pressure from on the shoulders of the government. If the members of Parliament are angry with the performance of the government, or if a specific minister wrong, or if the Prime Minister behaved in a bad way with Parliament, for example, and the members of Parliament became very angered and became agitated against him, the Constitution gives the members of Parliament a specific period of time in order to cool down, in order to reconsider things. Perhaps the Prime Minister is going to mend his relations with Parliament. Perhaps there is going to be some sort of middle ground between Parliament. Perhaps anything will happen during this 48 hours that is going to dissuade the members of Parliament and make them change their minds regarding withdrawing confidence from the government. So that when the vote happens, it will be in favor of the executive, in favor of the Council of Ministers, the Cabinet, not against it. So all of these are conditions that have been put in place in order to make it all the more difficult for the members of Parliament to withdraw confidence from the executive. The Prime Minister assumes greater powers during the times of cohabitation. We have discussed this, and we said that in times of cohabitation, the President takes a couple of steps backwards. In 2002, there was a constitutional amendment that was introduced by then President Jacques Chirac. Jacques Chirac in 2002 decreased the length of the presidency through this constitutional amendment from 7 years to 5 years. And he was the first president to apply this decreased limit on himself. So his first term spanned 7 years from 1995 to 2002, while his second term was only limited to 5 years. Why did he do so? What was the wisdom behind introducing this constitutional amendment? In fact, Jacques Chirac, as we said before, when he called a snap election in 1997, the results of the election were not like what he wanted. he had a parliament that came to be controlled by the opposition party. He did not want this situation to happen again. A situation of cohabitation once more in French politics. That's why he decided to decrease the length of the in order to synchronize the elections of the president and parliament. Because if you have elections taking place in order to select the president, in order to select parliament, it is very likely that the people are going to return the same parties to power, to put a president who belongs to a party that will also control the National Assembly. They are not going to divide their ballots. But if the elections to the President and the National Assembly are held in different times, if you have a year or two that separate the two elections, then there is a high probability and a high likelihood that the people might decide to change their minds and elect a National Assembly that is controlled by an opposition party, a party that is against the president. If, for example, the ratings of the president have decreased, if his performance in the economy was not so good, if he involved his country in international crises, if his foreign policies were not so popular by the people, if for one reason or another the performance of the president was not highly liked by the people, this might induce them to choose that would be controlled by the opposition party. And this is going to create a situation of cohabitation. Why? Because the times of the elections are different. Because the president is elected in one time and the National Assembly is elected at another time. So what Jacques Chirac did was that he wanted to decrease the likelihood of having a divided government. And this policy has paid off. Since the introduction of this constitutional amendment, it has not happened that the National Assembly came to be controlled by a party that is different from the party of the president. All the time, there has been a unified government in France after two. So the president controls, the party of the president has usually been in control of the National Assembly since the introduction of this constitutional amendment that lowered or decreased the limit or the length of the presidential term from 7 to 5 years. With this, we come to the end of this lecture. Oh, before we end this lecture, we have to know how the president is elected. The president of the Fifth Republic is elected by public vote. All the people who are aged 18 or over have the right to cast their ballots in order to elect their president. So the president is elected nationally. In fact, he is the only official in the French Republic who is elected nationally. And this gives him a lot of power. The system that is used is a candidate must secure an absolute majority of the votes. And by an absolute majority, again, we mean 10 plus 1 of the people who cast their votes, of all the people who cast their ballots. But because this is difficult to obtain, it is difficult for any single candidate for president to acquire or secure a majority of the votes in the first round. It is usually the case that the top competitor gets like no more than a quarter of the national vote, something like 25% or less, 24, 23%, no more than this. It is usually the case that there must be a second round or a second ballot that is held 14 days afterwards. So 2 weeks afterwards, we have a second round of balloting, and in the second ballot as well, an absolute majority of the votes is required. And in this round, only the top two candidates, the two candidates who managed to garner most of the votes, it is they who have the right to contest in the second ballot. And in the second ballot as well, you have to have an absolute majority of the votes in order to win and become president of the French Republic. This is called a two-round majority system. A two-round absolute majority system. With this, we come to the end of this lecture about the first institution, the executive authority, the presidency, and the council of ministers, or the cabinet. And next time, inshallah, we're going to talk about the legislature of the Fifth Republic. Thank you so much, and see you soon, inshallah. Goodbye.